A millionaire marries an elderly black beggar as a bet, thinking he can control everything. But the moment she walks into his life, his world begins to unravel. Beneath her quiet grace lies a mysterious past that could shatter everything he thought he knew. As scandal erupts and his empire starts to crumble, he uncovers a shocking truth. His family played a devastating role in her downfall. But this is just the beginning, because she has a condition of her own, and time is running out. Can this arrogant millionaire transform before it's too late? Or will his gamble cost him the one thing money can't buy? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead at the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, their light dancing off champagne flutes and designer watches. Elliot Harrington stood in the center of it all, his custom-made Italian suit setting him apart from even this well-dressed crowd. At 35, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no. Another glass, he snapped his fingers at a passing waiter, not bothering to look the man in the eye. The waiter fumbled slightly, nearly dropping his tray as he rushed to comply. And do try not to spill it this time. Yes, sir. Right away, sir, the waiter mumbled, his cheeks flushing red as he hurried away. From a nearby table, Tom Parker and Samuel Gray watched their friend's display with knowing smirks. Tom leaned back in his chair, swirling his whiskey. Look at him holding court like some kind of king. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly as he observed Elliot. He's gotten worse since taking over his father's company. Did you see how he spoke to that board member yesterday? Like the man was dirt beneath his shoes. Speaking of dirt, Tom chuckled. Did you see him this morning? Walked right past that old homeless woman who's always sitting near Harrington Tower. She tried to say good morning, and he acted like she was invisible. Samuel's lips curled into a calculating smile. You know what would be entertaining? A little wager to humble our friend? What did you have in mind? Something to prove he's not as superior as he thinks he is. Samuel's voice dropped lower. A challenge involving that woman he ignored. Mildred Carter, I believe her name is. Meanwhile, across the ballroom, Elliot continued his reign of casual cruelty. A young waitress approached with his fresh champagne, her hands trembling slightly. Finally, he said, snatching the glass. Some of the liquid sloshed onto his sleeve. Are you completely incompetent? Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? The waitress's eyes welled with tears. I'm so sorry, sir. Please let me help. Don't touch me, Elliot snapped. Just get out of my sight before you make an even bigger mess of things. As the waitress hurried away, Elliot turned back to his admirers, a group of young executives who laughed nervously at his outburst. He launched into a story about his latest business acquisition, speaking loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. The fool actually thought he could negotiate with me, Elliot boasted, as if he had any leverage. I simply reminded him who holds the real power in this city. Outside the hotel's grand entrance, Mildred Carter sat quietly on her usual bench, her dignified posture at odds with her worn clothing. Despite the morning chill, she offered a warm smile to passing pedestrians, most of whom hurried past without a glance. She had watched earlier as Elliot Harrington strode past her, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if she were nothing more than a shadow. Even when she had wished him good morning, his expression hadn't flickered. It was a familiar scenario, one that had played out every workday for months. Back in the ballroom, Tom and Samuel approached Elliot, their faces bright with artificial cheer. Samuel clapped a hand on Elliot's shoulder. Quite a show you're putting on tonight, old friend. Elliot smirked. Merely maintaining standards, Samuel. Someone has to show these people how things should be done. Of course, Tom agreed, exchanging a knowing look with Samuel. You've certainly shown everyone exactly who you are. The evening continued to sparkle around them, but beneath the surface, wheels were beginning to turn. Samuel's challenge was taking shape in his mind, and Elliot Harrington's comfortable world was about to be shaken to its core, though he didn't know it yet. The evening wore on, and the crowd at the Grand Plaza Hotel thinned. Elliot, Tom, and Samuel moved to a private corner of the bar, where leather chairs and dark wood paneling created an intimate atmosphere. I'm telling you, Elliot said, loosening his tie slightly, There isn't a person in this city I can't bend to my will. It's all about knowing which buttons to push. Tom leaned forward, his eyes glinting with mischief. Anyone? That's quite a claim, Elliot. Name someone. Anyone. Elliot took another sip of his scotch, his confidence unwavering. I'll show you how it's done. Samuel and Tom exchanged meaningful glances before Tom cleared his throat. Actually, I have someone in mind. Someone who might prove challenging. There's no such thing as challenging for me, Elliot scoffed. Who is it? Mildred Carter. Elliot's forehead wrinkled in confusion. Who? The homeless woman who sits outside your building every day, Samuel explained, watching Elliot's reaction carefully. The one you walked past this morning. Elliot barked out a laugh. That old bag lady, what about her? Tom set his glass down with deliberate slowness. I bet you couldn't convince her to marry you. The laughter died in Elliot's throat. Excuse me? You heard me. Tom's voice took on a challenging edge. Marry her and stay married for 3 months. Since you can manipulate anyone, it should be easy, right? Elliot's face reddened. That's ridiculous. Why would I even consider such a thing? $5 million, Samuel interjected smoothly. That's why. Tom and I will each put up $2.5 million. If you succeed, the money is yours. I don't need your money, Elliot sneered, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. Then let's make it interesting, Tom pressed. If you fail, you donate $5 million to the homeless shelter downtown, the one your father tried to shut down last year. Elliot's jaw tightened at the mention of his father. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, considering the proposition. 3 months, you said? 3 months of marriage, Samuel confirmed. And it has to be legal. No tricks, no bribes to officials. A real marriage. A slow, cruel smile spread across Elliot's face. You know what? I'll do it. It'll be amusing to see that old woman try to fit into my world. And when the 3 months are up, I'll dump her right back where I found her. How charitable of you, Tom said dryly. Think about it, Elliot continued, warming to the idea. She'll be so grateful for a few months of luxury, she'll do anything I say. And imagine the headlines. Billionaire's charitable marriage to homeless woman. The PR alone would be worth it. Samuel raised his glass. So we have a deal? We do. Elliot clinked his glass against Samuel's. But let's add one more condition. This stays between us. I don't need the board getting nervous about their CEO marrying someone from the streets. Of course, Tom agreed. Our little secret. To the future, Mrs. Harrington, Samuel toasted, his voice laced with barely concealed amusement. Elliot drained his glass, already plotting his approach. I'll have her saying I do within a week. That woman won't know what hit her. The 3 men sat back in their leather chairs, each lost in their own thoughts. Through the bar's window, they could see the city lights twinkling like stars, while somewhere out there, Mildred Carter had no idea her life was about to change dramatically, all because of a bet between wealthy men who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in their game. The next morning, Elliot straightened his designer tie as he strode down the busy sidewalk. The usual crowd parted before him like water around a rock, but today he wasn't heading to his office. Instead, he stopped in front of Mildred Carter, who sat quietly on a weathered blanket near his building's entrance. Despite her worn clothes, there was something striking about her posture, an unmistakable dignity that made Elliot pause for a fraction of a second. She didn't look up at him immediately, finishing what appeared to be a prayer before meeting his gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she said softly, surprising him with her knowledge of his name. Elliot recovered quickly, plastering on his most charming smile. "You know who I am. Everyone here knows who you are." Her voice carried no judgment, just simple truth. "Well then," he said, shifting uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "That makes this easier." He glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "I have a proposition for you." Mildred folded her hands in her lap, waiting patiently. "How would you like to live in my penthouse?" He gestured toward the gleaming tower above them. "New clothes, good food, The best of everything? And what would be required of me? She asked calmly. Elliot's smile widened. Marriage. To me. For 3 months. He expected shock, disbelief, or immediate grateful acceptance. Instead, Mildred's expression remained serene, her eyes studying his face with unexpected intensity. That's quite an unusual proposal, Mr. Harrington, she said, especially from a man who has walked past me every day for 2 years without so much as a glance. Elliot felt heat rise to his face. Well, I've had a change of heart. Have you? Mildred's voice was gentle but knowing. Or is there something else behind this sudden interest in marriage to a homeless woman? Does it matter? Elliot snapped, his patience wearing thin. I'm offering you a way off these streets, 3 months of luxury, and then… He caught himself before saying, back to the streets. And then what, Mr. Harrington? Then we go our separate ways, he finished smoothly. No strings attached. Mildred was quiet for a long moment, her hands still folded peacefully in her lap. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair, and Elliot noticed for the first time that her eyes held a sharp intelligence that made him distinctly uncomfortable. I'll agree, she said finally, on one condition. Elliot fought back a smirk. Here it comes, he thought. Money, security, something greedy. You must stay married to me for the full 3 months, Mildred continued. No divorce, no separation, no sending me away to some hotel. We live as husband and wife under the same roof for the entire time. Elliot blinked, thrown off balance by the simplicity of her request. That's it? That's your condition? Yes. She smiled, and there was something in that smile that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. Do we have a deal, Mr. Harrington? We do, he said quickly, extending his hand to help her up. And please, call me Elliot. Mildred took his hand, rising with surprising grace. Very well, Elliot. When shall we begin? Standing face to face with her, Elliot was struck by an unsettling feeling that he was missing something important. There was a quiet strength in Mildred's bearing that didn't match his preconceptions of a desperate homeless woman. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on how easily he'd achieved his goal. We'll go to the courthouse right now, he said, already reaching for his phone to call his driver. I have everything arranged. The courthouse steps were swarming with reporters and photographers, their cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. News of Elliot Harrington's surprise marriage had spread through social media like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers and media personalities from across the city. Mr. Harrington, is this a publicity stunt? One reporter shouted. Miss Carter, what made you say yes? Called another. Elliot guided Mildred through the crowd, his hand hovering near her elbow but not quite touching it. She moved with unexpected grace in the simple cream-colored dress his assistant had hastily purchased. Her silver hair was neatly styled, though she'd declined the offer of professional makeup, preferring just a touch of lipstick. Inside the courthouse's grand hall, Tom Parker and Samuel Gray stood with a group of Elliot's wealthy friends, all trying to hide their smirks behind champagne glasses. The marble floors echoed with whispers and poorly concealed laughter. This is better than I imagined, Tom muttered to Samuel, watching as Elliot and Mildred approached the justice of the peace. Look at his face. He can barely hide his disgust. But Samuel wasn't laughing anymore. There was something about Mildred's bearing that made him uneasy. She carried herself like royalty, her head high and her shoulders straight. It was as if she was the one doing everyone else a favor by being there. The ceremony began, and the whispers died down. Elliot's friends pressed forward, phones ready to capture every moment of what they considered prime entertainment. But as Mildred spoke her vows, her voice clear and dignified, the smirks began to fade. I, Mildred Carter, take thee, Elliot Harrington, to be my lawful wedded husband. Her words rang through the hall with such sincerity that several guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive shoes. Elliot's voice, in contrast, sounded hollow and rehearsed. His hands were clammy as he slipped the simple gold band onto Mildred's finger. When she placed his ring on his finger, her touch was gentle but firm, and her eyes met his with an intensity that made him look away first. After the ceremony, reporters crowded around the newlyweds in the courthouse lobby. Photographers jostled for position, their cameras clicking frantically. "Mrs. Harrington, how does it feel to go from homeless to married to one of the city's wealthiest men?" Before Elliot could intervene with his prepared statement, Mildred answered with a smile that somehow made the reporter's question seem crude. "Wealth comes in many forms," she said softly. "And sometimes, the richest people are the poorest of all." The reporters fell silent for a moment, pens frozen above their notepads. Elliot stared at his new wife, a strange feeling settling in his stomach. This wasn't going according to plan at all. Tom Parker pushed through the crowd, his face flushed from champagne. "Speech," he called out, earning encouraging nods from Elliot's other friends. "Let's hear from the happy couple." Elliot cleared his throat, ready to deliver some bland platitudes about love at first sight, but Mildred spoke first. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the lobby. "Marriage is a sacred commitment, one that should transform both parties into better versions of themselves. I look forward to these next 3 months with great anticipation." The silence that followed was deafening. Elliot's friends exchanged confused glances. Had she just announced their 3-month arrangement to everyone? But before anyone could react, Mildred had already turned toward the door, moving with such quiet authority that the crowd parted automatically to let her through. Elliot hurried after her, aware of the cameras still clicking and the bewildered murmurs behind them. For the first time since this whole thing began, he wondered if he might have underestimated Mildred Carter. The reception was held at the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom, a space dripping with crystal chandeliers and golden accents that screamed of wealth and privilege. Elliot had insisted on the venue, determined to showcase his fortune even in this mockery of a wedding celebration. Guests mingled around elegant tables decorated with towering flower arrangements, sipping champagne worth more than what most people earned in a week. Mildred sat at the main table, looking completely at ease despite being surrounded by luxury that contrasted sharply with her former life on the streets. When the time came for speeches, Tom Parker clinked his crystal glass with a silver spoon, his face flushed from too much champagne. "And now let's hear from our lovely bride." The room fell quiet as Mildred rose from her seat. She wore her simple cream dress like it was a royal gown, commanding attention without demanding it. Elliot watched her with narrowed eyes, expecting some display of gratitude or fawning appreciation for his generosity. "Thank you all for joining us today," Mildred began, her voice clear and steady. "I've spent many years observing life from the sidewalk outside this very hotel. It's given me quite a unique perspective on wealth and what it truly means to be rich." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several guests glanced at Elliot, who maintained a practiced smile even as his jaw tightened. "I've watched people rush past in designer suits, too busy counting their millions to count their blessings," Mildred continued, her gentle tone carrying an edge of truth that cut through the pretense in the room. "I've seen them measure their worth in square footage and stock options, while overlooking the priceless gifts of kindness and compassion." A woman in an expensive red dress coughed nervously. Someone's silverware clattered against fine china. "My new husband," Mildred turned to look directly at Elliot, "is a man who has everything money can buy, but perhaps in these next 3 months we'll discover together what money cannot buy. Things like genuine happiness, true friendship, and authentic love." Elliot's smile became fixed and brittle. He could feel Tom Parker and Samuel Gray watching him, could sense the growing discomfort in the room as Mildred's words stripped away the shallow veneer of their social circle. "You see," Mildred's voice softened but somehow became even more powerful. "True wealth isn't found in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's found in the capacity to see the humanity in others, to extend kindness without expecting anything in return, to recognize that every person, regardless of their circumstances, has inherent dignity and worth." The silence in the ballroom was absolute now. Several guests were staring at their plates, unable to meet Mildred's gentle but knowing gaze. Others looked thoughtful, as if hearing these truths for the first time. "So I thank you, Elliot," she concluded, turning fully toward him, "for this opportunity. These next 3 months promise to be quite educational. for both of us." She sat down amid scattered, uncertain applause. Elliot's hands were clenched under the table, his knuckles white with suppressed anger. He'd expected to humiliate her with this arrangement, but somehow she'd managed to turn his own reception into a subtle but devastating critique of everything he stood for. Looking around the room, he could see the impact of her words. His wealthy friends were avoiding his eyes, suddenly very interested in their desserts or wine glasses. Even Tom Parker, who had started this whole thing, was looking uncomfortable, swirling his champagne with unusual concentration. For the first time since this charade began, Elliot felt a flicker of uncertainty. He'd assumed Mildred would be grateful, submissive, easily controlled. Instead, she'd just stood in front of his entire social circle and gracefully exposed their collective shallow materialism, all while maintaining an air of dignified wisdom that made any potential rebuttal from him seem petty and defensive. The morning after the wedding, Elliot's mansion buzzed with nervous energy as the staff prepared for Mildred's arrival. The grand foyer gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, its marble floors polished to mirror-like perfection. Elliot stood at the bottom of the sweeping staircase, checking his watch repeatedly. When the front door opened, Mildred entered carrying only a small, worn suitcase. She paused, taking in the opulent surroundings with quiet observation rather than the awe Elliot had expected. "Martha will show you to your room," Elliot said curtly, gesturing to the nervous-looking housekeeper. "It's in the East Wing, far from my quarters." Mildred smiled warmly at Martha. "Thank you, dear, but first, would you mind introducing me to everyone? I'd love to meet the people who keep this beautiful home running." Martha's eyes widened, unused to such consideration from the mansion's residents. Over the next hour, Mildred learned every staff member's name, asking about their families and listening intently to their responses. The stiff formality in the air gradually melted away as the workers responded to her genuine interest. Within days, the household's atmosphere began to shift. Mildred rose early each morning, sharing coffee and conversation with the kitchen staff before they started their duties. She remembered details about their lives: Jorge's daughter's upcoming quinceañera, Beth's mother's health struggles, Kevin's night school classes. Elliot watched with growing irritation as she reorganized cleaning schedules to be more efficient while giving the staff more reasonable hours. She turned the unused conservatory into a break room where employees could rest during their shifts. The staff's productivity improved, yet Elliot couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. One evening, he came home to find Mildred in the kitchen, teaching Maria, the cook, new recipes while they laughed together. The scene stopped him in his tracks. The kitchen had never held such warmth before. "Mr. Harrington," Maria said, noticing him, "would you like to try the soup Mrs. Carter taught me to make? It's her grandmother's recipe." Before he could refuse, Mildred was already ladling the soup into a bowl. "It's just simple vegetable soup," she said, "but made with love. That's the secret ingredient my grandmother swore by." Reluctantly, Elliot tasted it. The flavor was rich and comforting, unlike anything his expensive personal chefs had ever prepared. He caught himself almost complimenting it before remembering his stance. "It's adequate," he said stiffly, but noticed the knowing look Mildred and Maria exchanged. Later that week, Elliot overheard two maids talking as they dusted the library. "Mrs. Carter helped me figure out how to get Tommy into that after-school program," one said. "She even wrote a reference letter. My boy's never been so excited about learning." "She's like that with everyone," the other replied. "Yesterday, she sat with Mr. Phillips for an hour when he got news about his wife's cancer. Just listened and held his hand. Who does that?" Elliot retreated to his study, unsettled by their conversation. He'd expected Mildred to be an embarrassment, someone his staff would quietly mock. Instead, she moved through his home with grace and purpose, transforming cold efficiency into genuine connection. He watched through his study window as Mildred helped the gardener plant new flowers, her hands dirty, but her face bright with joy. For a moment, he felt a strange ache in his chest, a recognition of something authentic and valuable that all his wealth couldn't buy. The mansion that had once echoed with formal silence now hummed with life. Laughter drifted through hallways, warm greetings replaced curt nods, and even the air seemed lighter somehow. Elliot found himself noticing small changes. Fresh flowers appeared daily in unexpected corners, handwritten notes of encouragement left for staff members, cookies baked for someone's child's school event. The morning headlines hit Elliot's desk like a physical blow. Harrington Industries under investigation, unethical practices alleged in Asian markets. His hands trembled as he scanned the article, detailing accusations of worker exploitation and environmental violations. Lauren Adams, his assistant, rushed into his office, her face pale. "Mr. Harrington, the Jang Group has pulled out of the merger. They're citing ethical concerns and reputation risks." Elliot's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Social media was having a field day. One tweet particularly stung. First marries a homeless woman, now this. Harrington Jr. destroying Daddy's legacy piece by piece. The board meeting that afternoon was brutal. Stern faces surrounded the mahogany table as projections showed plummeting stock prices. Board member after board member questioned his leadership, drawing pointed connections between his publicity stunt marriage and the current crisis. "Your judgment has become questionable, Elliot," said James Morton, the eldest board member. "This marriage to a street person, and now this scandal. Perhaps you're not ready for this level of responsibility." Elliot stormed home, his perfectly tailored suit feeling like a straitjacket. He found Mildred in the garden, peacefully tending to her newly planted roses. The sight of her serenity made his blood boil. "This is all your fault," he shouted, throwing his briefcase onto a nearby bench. "Ever since you came into my life, everything's fallen apart." Mildred straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "Is that what you truly believe, Elliot? The board thinks I've lost my mind. The media's having a field day. My reputation is in shambles because of this circus." He gestured wildly between them. "Your reputation," Mildred said quietly. "Or your father's?" Elliot froze. She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Those workers in Asia, the ones being exploited, did you ever meet them? Or did you just see numbers on a spreadsheet like your father taught you?" "You don't know anything about business," he spat. "I know about people," she replied. "And right now you're so blinded by pride that you can't see the real solution standing right in front of you." "Oh? And what's that?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "Take responsibility. Meet with those workers. Listen to their stories. Show the world that Elliot Harrington is not his father's son, but his own man. One who can admit mistakes and make them right." Lauren appeared at the garden door, clutching her tablet. "Mr. Harrington, the PR team has a crisis management strategy ready for review." "In a minute," he snapped, still glaring at Mildred. "Your father built an empire through fear and force," Mildred said softly. "Maybe it's time to try building something through respect and understanding instead." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he saw himself through others' eyes. The arrogant heir, desperately clinging to his father's outdated methods, married to a woman who possessed the wisdom he'd been too proud to see. Lauren cleared her throat nervously. "Sir, the board is requesting an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. They're discussing a vote of no confidence." Elliot's world spun. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd inherited, was slipping through his fingers. He turned to lash out at Mildred again, but the words died in his throat when he saw her expression. Not judgment or satisfaction, but simple, steady compassion. The morning after his outburst in the garden, Elliot found himself lingering in his home office, unable to focus on the crisis management reports before him. Through the open window, he heard laughter drifting up from the kitchen, a sound that had been rare in this house since his mother passed away years ago. Curious, he made his way downstairs, stopping short of the kitchen entrance when he heard voices in conversation. "It's just that Tommy's so smart, Mrs. Carter," Maria Sanchez, his housekeeper of 15 years, was saying. "He got accepted to 3 universities, but even with scholarships, I don't see how I can make it work on my salary." "First," Mildred's warm voice replied, "call me Mildred. And second, have you looked into income-based repayment programs? There are also work-study opportunities that could help Tommy earn while he learns." Elliot peered around the corner. Maria sat at the kitchen island, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, while Mildred chopped vegetables for what appeared to be soup. The other staff members were gathered around, listening intently. "But the financial aid forms are so complicated," Maria sighed, "and the interest rates on student loans." "Let me tell you about compound interest," Mildred said, setting down her knife. "Back when I ran my business, I learned that understanding money is like understanding a language. Once you know the basics, everything else starts making sense." Elliot's eyebrows shot up. Business? He'd never heard Mildred mention anything about her past. "You owned a business, Mrs. Carr? I mean Mildred?" asked James, the groundskeeper. "I did," Mildred smiled, resuming her chopping. "A chain of educational centers. We helped people learn financial literacy, especially in underserved communities." Her knife moved with practiced precision. "The key is to start with what you have and understand how to make it grow." For the next 30 minutes, Elliot stood rooted to his spot, listening as Mildred broke down complex financial concepts into simple, understandable terms. She explained investment strategies, debt management, and the importance of emergency funds, all while preparing lunch with the staff. "You know what?" Maria said, wiping away tears. "This is the first time I've felt hopeful about Tommy's future. Thank you, Mildred." "We all have wisdom to share," Mildred replied, stirring the soup. "Sometimes life takes away our material possessions, but it can never take away what we know and what we can teach others." The staff exchanged glances, and Elliot could see the respect in their eyes. This wasn't the deference they showed him out of fear or obligation. This was genuine admiration. Mrs. Carter, Sophie, the young maid, spoke up shyly. "Would you mind if we had these talks more often? Maybe make it a regular thing during lunch?" "Of course," Mildred answered, "though I suspect Mr. Harrington might not approve of such informal gatherings." "Mr. Harrington doesn't need to know," James muttered, then quickly looked around guiltily. Elliot felt his face flush with shame. Was this how his staff truly saw him? As someone to hide from, to fear? He watched as Mildred served everyone bowls of soup, the kitchen filled with easy conversation and genuine warmth. The staff shared their dreams and worries freely, and Mildred listened to each one with genuine interest, offering gentle guidance and encouragement. Standing there, Elliot realized he knew nothing about these people who kept his home running smoothly. He'd never asked Maria about her children, never knew James was taking night classes, never noticed Sophie's talent for numbers. And Mildred? Who was this woman, really? How had someone who clearly understood business and finance ended up on the streets? What had happened to her educational centers? The questions swirled in his mind as he quietly retreated to his office, the sound of laughter following him up the stairs. That evening, Elliot sat in his dimly lit office staring at the folder Greg Foster had just placed on his desk. The private investigator stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me what you found," Elliot said, not yet opening the file. Greg cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, or should I say Mrs. Mildred Thompson Carter, was quite the success story in the late 90s. She built a clothing empire from scratch, starting with a single boutique in Chicago. Elliot leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edge of the folder. A clothing business. Carter Creations was the name. By 1998, she had 37 stores across the Midwest, specialized in affordable businesswear for working women. Greg pulled out some old newspaper clippings from his briefcase. She was featured in Business Weekly, named one of the top 40 under 40 entrepreneurs. The yellowed magazine cover showed a younger Mildred, dressed in an elegant suit, her smile confident and warm. Her eyes held the same quiet dignity they did now. "What happened?" Elliot asked, studying the photograph. "That's where things get murky," Greg said, shifting his weight. In 2000, the company collapsed practically overnight. There were accusations of fraud, embezzlement, cooking the books, but nothing was ever proven in court. Elliot opened the folder, scanning through documents and newspaper headlines. Carter Creations empire crumbles. Rising star falls. Scandal rocks retail chain. He looked up at Greg. "But you said nothing was proven?" "No, sir. In fact..." Greg hesitated. "Some of the documentation from that time period seems to have vanished. Court records, financial statements, all gone." almost like someone wanted to bury the truth. Elliot's fingers drummed against his desk. Any connection to Harrington Industries? Greg's silence spoke volumes. Foster? Your father's name came up in my research, Mr. Harrington. Richard Harrington was on the board of First Metro Bank at the time, the same bank that suddenly called in all of Carter Creations' loans. Elliot felt his stomach twist. He remembered his father's business philosophy all too well. In business, son, you either devour or get devoured. There's more, Greg continued. Mrs. Carter's husband, James Carter, was found dead in their home 2 weeks after the company's collapse. Official cause was listed as heart attack, but what? The autopsy report is another document that's mysteriously missing. Elliot stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens where Mildred often sat reading in the afternoons. The same woman who gave financial advice to his staff, who carried herself with such quiet strength, had once built an empire from nothing, only to lose everything. Did she ever try to rebuild? He asked. No, sir. After her husband's death, she disappeared from public view. The next record I could find was from a homeless shelter in 2015. Greg paused. Though I did find something interesting from last year. She's been volunteering at a women's business center teaching financial literacy classes, even while living on the streets. Elliot turned back to his desk and picked up the old magazine cover again. The young Mildred's eyes seemed to challenge him, making him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. Thank you, Foster, that will be all. After the investigator left, Elliot spent hours poring over the files trying to piece together the puzzle of Mildred Carter's past. But the more he read, the more questions emerged. And the more he thought about his father's possible involvement in her downfall, the more his conscience nagged at him. What really happened in 2000? Why did all those records disappear? And why did Mildred agree to marry him, knowing his connection to Richard Harrington? The answers seemed just out of reach, buried beneath 2 decades of carefully constructed silence. The next morning, Greg Foster's call came early. Elliot's hands trembled as he held his phone, listening to the private investigator's discoveries. I found the missing documents, Mr. Harrington. They were buried in old backup servers from First Metro Bank. Greg's voice was hesitant. Your father? He deliberately orchestrated Mrs. Carter's downfall. Elliot sank into his leather chair, his throat tight. Explain. Richard Harrington used his position on the bank's board to access Carter Creations' confidential financial records. He then leaked false information to suppliers, claiming the company was near bankruptcy. Greg paused. The suppliers panicked, demanded immediate payment, and when Mrs. Carter couldn't pay them all at once, the bank called in the loans, Elliot finished, his voice hollow. Yes, but there's more. Your father's company, Harrington Fashion Division, launched their affordable business wear line just 3 months after Carter Creations collapsed. They even used some of her original designs. Elliot closed his eyes, remembering his father's proud smile when that clothing line became their most profitable division. How many times had Richard Harrington boasted about his business acumen, teaching his son that success meant crushing the competition? The sound of gentle humming drifted through his office door. Mildred was in the garden again, tending to the roses she'd planted, the same woman his father had destroyed. Send me everything, Elliot said, ending the call. Later that afternoon, as he sat surrounded by damning evidence of his father's actions, the office door opened. Mildred stood there, still wearing her gardening gloves, her expression serene but knowing. Found what you were looking for? She asked quietly. Elliot's head snapped up. How did you? Private investigators aren't as discreet as they think. She walked in, removing her gloves. Especially when they start asking questions at homeless shelters. Shame burned through Elliot. Mildred, what my father did was cruel? Calculated? Yes. She sat down across from him, her eyes holding no anger, only a deep wisdom that made him feel small. But hatred is a heavy burden to carry, Elliot. I chose to set it down long ago. You knew? He whispered. All this time you knew it was my father? I suspected. The timing was too perfect, the execution too precise. She picked up a photo of Richard Harrington from his desk. "When you proposed this marriage, I saw an opportunity, not for revenge, but for something more valuable." "What?" "To show that success built on destroying others isn't success at all. Your father's actions didn't just ruin my business, Elliot. They cost me my husband." James couldn't bear the shame, the accusations. His heart gave out from the stress. Her voice wavered slightly, but her dignity remained intact. "But look at what your father's victory created. A son who measures his worth in dollars and treats people like pawns in a game." Elliot felt tears burning his eyes. "How can you even look at me, knowing what my family did to you?" "Because you're not your father, Elliot. You're searching for the truth even when it hurts. That's more courage than Richard Harrington ever showed." She stood up, straightening her simple dress. "The question is, what will you do with that truth?" The weight of his father's legacy pressed down on Elliot's shoulders. Every memory of Richard Harrington's business lessons now felt tainted, every triumph hollow. But Mildred's quiet strength, her refusal to let bitterness poison her soul, sparked something new in him, a desperate need to make things right. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to fix this." Mildred walked to the door, then turned back. "Maybe that's the first honest thing you've said since we met." The next morning, Elliot sat in the boardroom, his father's portrait looming over him. The quarterly reports projected on the screen showed impressive profits, but for the first time, he found himself questioning how those numbers were achieved. And finally, Douglas Chen, his CFO, concluded, "The Morgan Heights development deal. Once we push out the current residents, we can begin construction next month." Elliot's stomach tightened. Just yesterday, he'd overheard Mildred talking to Maria, his housekeeper, about her sister living in Morgan Heights. The development would displace hundreds of families, many of whom had lived there for generations. "We're not doing it," Elliot said quietly. The room fell silent. Douglas blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Cancel the Morgan Heights deal." Elliot's voice grew stronger. "We'll lose the deposit, but I won't be responsible for destroying a community." "Mr. Harrington," Barbara Wells, a senior board member, leaned forward. "This deal represents a potential profit of $50 million. And the cost?" Elliot stood up, walking to the window. 300 families losing their homes, small businesses going under. He turned to face the board. "My father taught me that business was about winning at any cost. I'm starting to think he was wrong." The board members exchanged worried glances. Someone whispered about that woman's influence. "If this is about your unusual marriage situation," Douglas began carefully. "This is about doing what's right," Elliot cut him off. "Draft a press release. We're pulling out of Morgan Heights and we'll be exploring ways to invest in the existing community instead." Back home, Elliot watched Mildred working with the kitchen staff, teaching them how to make her grandmother's cornbread. The easy way she connected with people, her genuine interest in their lives. It was so different from his own awkward attempts at being more approachable. That morning, he'd tried complimenting James, his driver, on his new haircut. The man had looked so startled he nearly drove into a lamppost. When Elliot asked Sarah, his personal assistant, about her weekend, she'd stammered through a response, clearly wondering if this was some kind of test. "They don't trust me," he said later, joining Mildred in the garden. "The staff. I'm trying to be different, but—" "Trust takes time," Mildred replied, pruning her roses with careful precision. "These people have spent years seeing you as someone who barely acknowledged their existence. Change doesn't happen overnight." "How do you do it?" he asked. "Make everyone feel so seen?" Mildred set down her pruning shears. "I remember what it's like to be invisible. When I lost everything, people who used to seek my advice couldn't even meet my eyes on the street. But dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's something you hold on to no matter what." Elliot watched as Maria approached hesitantly with fresh lemonade. To his surprise, Mildred invited her to sit with them. "Maria's son just got accepted to 3 colleges," Mildred announced proudly. "That's wonderful," Elliot said, trying to sound natural. "Which ones?" As Maria cautiously shared her son's achievements, Elliot noticed how Mildred guided the conversation, drawing them both out, creating a moment of genuine connection. He saw Maria's shoulders gradually relax, saw her smile become more real. Later that evening, Elliot found himself in his study, staring at his father's old business journals. The pages were filled with strategies for hostile takeovers, methods of leveraging weakness, celebrations of destroyed competition. He thought of Mildred's quiet strength, her ability to maintain her humanity, even after losing everything. Maybe success isn't about winning, he murmured to himself. Maybe it's about how many people you lift up along the way. The next morning, Mildred watched as Elliot proudly showed her the changes he'd made to the company's charitable giving program. He'd increased the budget significantly and added several new initiatives. "What do you think?" he asked, clearly expecting praise. Mildred's expression remained neutral. "It's a nice gesture, Elliot, but throwing money at problems isn't the same as understanding them." His smile faltered. "I'm trying to help. Isn't that what you wanted?" "What I want," Mildred said carefully, "is for you to understand that real change requires more than writing checks. It requires getting your hands dirty, facing the consequences of past actions, and making genuine sacrifices." Elliot's jaw tightened. "I canceled the Morgan Heights deal. I'm changing how we do business." "And that's a start," Mildred acknowledged. "But there's someone I'd like you to meet." Later that afternoon, they visited a small bakery in a modest neighborhood. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, but the shop was nearly empty. A middle-aged black man looked up from behind the counter, his face lined with worry. "Elliot, this is James Turner," Mildred said. "His family has owned this bakery for 3 generations." James wiped his hands on his apron and extended one to Elliot. His grip was firm, despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "Mr. Harrington?" "James's bakery is struggling," Mildred explained. "Partly because of the shopping center your father's company built 2 blocks away. The one that brought in a chain bakery with prices local businesses couldn't compete with." Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "That was 15 years ago. And we've been fighting to survive ever since," James said quietly. "My grandfather started this place in 1950. My father worked here until the day he died. Now I might be the one who has to close our doors." Elliot looked around. The display cases were spotless but half empty. The tables were worn but clean. Everything spoke of pride and care, despite difficult circumstances. "Your father's development changed everything," James continued. "Not just for us, but for the whole neighborhood. Small businesses started closing one by one. People lost their livelihoods, their dreams." Elliot walked to the window, looking out at the street. He could see the massive shopping center looming in the distance, its corporate logos bright against the sky. "What do you need?" he asked finally. "I don't want charity," James said firmly. "Good," Mildred interjected, "because that's not what you're going to get. Elliot's going to learn about running a small business. From you." Elliot turned sharply. "What?" "3 days a week you'll work here," Mildred said. "Learn what it really takes to run a family business. Understand the challenges. Then maybe you'll be better equipped to make meaningful changes." "My board will never—" "Your board doesn't need to know," Mildred cut him off. "This isn't about publicity or corporate image. It's about understanding the real impact of corporate decisions on people's lives." Elliot looked at James, who stood straighter. "I won't go easy on you," James warned. "If you're here to learn, you'll learn everything, from opening at 4 a.m. to dealing with suppliers who won't extend credit anymore." Elliot felt the weight of both their gazes. He thought about his father's portrait in the boardroom, about the empire built on crushing smaller competitors. Then he thought about Mildred's words about real sacrifice and commitment. "When do I start?" he asked. "Tomorrow," James said. 4 a.m. sharp. Wear clothes you don't mind getting flour on." As they left the bakery, Elliot turned to Mildred. "You planned this, didn't you?" "Sometimes," she replied. "The best way to understand others is to walk in their shoes, even if those shoes are covered in flour." The next morning, Elliot arrived at Turner's Bakery at exactly 4 a.m. His designer clothes had been replaced with simple jeans and a t-shirt. James was already there, his sleeves rolled up as he prepared the day's first batch of bread. "Ready to work?" James asked, tossing Elliot an apron. The next few hours were a blur of physical labor. Elliot's muscles ached as he helped James lift heavy bags of flour and operate ancient mixing equipment. The heat from the ovens made sweat trickle down his back and flour coated everything, including his expensive watch. "This mixer's been giving us trouble," James explained, showing Elliot how to work with the temperamental machine. "Can't afford to replace it. The repair bills alone eat into our profits." As they worked, James's teenage daughter Sarah arrived to help before school. She moved with practiced efficiency, knowing exactly what needed to be done. "Dad's been teaching me since I was tall enough to reach the counter," she said proudly. Elliot watched their easy interaction, remembering his own distant relationship with his father. Richard Harrington had never taught him about hard work, only about winning at all costs. By mid-morning, Elliot's hands were raw from kneading dough, but the smell of fresh bread filled him with an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment. Then he saw James frowning over a stack of bills. "Supply costs keep rising," James explained when he caught Elliot looking. "But we can't raise our prices much more without losing customers to that chain store. They can afford to sell at a loss until small businesses like us fold." The words hit Elliot hard. He'd used similar tactics himself, never considering the human cost. "How do you keep going?" he asked. James gestured around the bakery. "This place isn't just a business. It's my family's legacy. Every recipe has a story. That coffee cake? My grandmother created it during the Depression when ingredients were scarce. The sourdough starter is older than I am. You can't put a price on that." Later that afternoon, Mildred visited the bakery. She found Elliot at the counter, awkwardly trying to make change for a customer. His hair was dusted with flour and there was a smudge of chocolate on his cheek. "How's the lesson going?" she asked after the customer left. "It's..." Elliot paused, searching for words. "Eye-opening. James works harder than anyone I've ever known, but the deck is stacked against him. My father's company, my company, we deliberately created impossible conditions for businesses like this. And now? Now I understand why you wanted me to see this. It's one thing to read reports about market competition. It's another to watch a family fight to preserve 3 generations of hard work." Mildred nodded approvingly. "Understanding is the first step. But what will you do with that understanding?" "I want to help," Elliot said quickly. "I could offer..." "Be careful," Mildred warned. "Quick solutions often come from guilt, not wisdom. Real change requires more than a single gesture." James approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "She's right," he said. "We don't need a savior, Mr. Harrington. We need a fair chance to compete. We need big corporations to remember that their success shouldn't come at the cost of destroying communities." Elliot looked around the bakery, seeing it with new eyes. The worn but clean tables, the carefully handwritten signs, the wall of photos showing 3 generations of Turners serving their community. He thought about his father's ruthless business tactics, about all the similar family businesses that had been crushed under the wheels of corporate profit. "I have a lot to learn," he admitted quietly. "Yes," Mildred agreed, "but at least now you're willing to learn." The headline blazed across every major news outlet. "Harrington heirs marriage scandal. Father destroyed wife's business empire." Rebecca Lyons' investigative piece for the Daily Chronicle laid bare the ugly truth of Richard Harrington's systematic destruction of Mildred Carter's clothing company 25 years ago. Elliot sat in his office, staring at the article on his computer screen. The words seemed to burn into his vision. Deliberate sabotage, racist targeting, corporate conspiracy. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from board members and shareholders. Lauren Adams, his assistant, rushed in without knocking. "Mr. Harrington, there are protesters gathering outside. The police are setting up barriers, but social media is exploding. They're calling for boycotts of all Harrington enterprises." Through his office window, Elliot could see the growing crowd. Their signs told the story. "Justice for Mildred Carter. End corporate racism. Harrington Truckers, destroyer of dreams." "Sir?" Lauren's voice was gentle. "What should we do?" Before Elliot could answer, Mildred appeared in the doorway. She moved with her usual quiet grace, seemingly unbothered by the chaos erupting around them. "The truth always finds its way into the light," she said, settling into a chair across from his desk. "What matters now is how you respond to it." Elliot ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "I didn't know. I was just a kid when all this happened." "But you know now," Mildred replied. "And you're not just Richard Harrington's son anymore. You're the man who's been learning about community at Turner's Bakery, the man who's beginning to see beyond profit margins." The chants from outside grew louder. Lauren's phone kept buzzing with media requests. "Ms. Carter," Lauren ventured, "perhaps you could make a statement? Tell them this is all in the past?" Mildred shook her head. "This isn't my moment to sweep things under the rug. This is Elliot's opportunity to face the truth and help others understand its importance." Elliot stood and paced the office. "The board will fight any admission of wrongdoing. The lawyers will say it opens us up to lawsuits." "And what does your conscience say?" Mildred asked quietly. The question stopped him in his tracks. He thought about James Turner's struggling bakery, about all the other small businesses his father had crushed, about Mildred, who had lost everything but maintained her dignity. "The article mentions dozens of other businesses your father targeted," Mildred continued. "Not just mine. Each one represented someone's dreams, someone's legacy. The truth isn't just about me, Elliot. It's about a system that values profit over people." Lauren's phone buzzed again. "Rebecca Lyons is downstairs. She's requesting an interview." Elliot looked at Mildred, who met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes," she said, "the most powerful thing a person can do is acknowledge the truth, even when it hurts." The protesters' chants echoed through the building. Elliot walked to the window, watching the crowd grow. He saw young activists standing alongside older men and women who might have been business owners from his father's era. Their anger was justified, but maybe it could become something more constructive. "Lauren," he said finally, "tell Ms. Lyons I'll speak with her, and contact our PR team. I want to hold a press conference, but not to deny anything. It's time to talk about real changes." Mildred smiled slightly. "And what will you say?" "The truth. All of it. About my father, about the company's history, about the systems we helped create." He straightened his shoulders. "And then I want to talk about how we're going to make it right." The press conference room buzzed with tension. Camera flashes lit up the podium where Elliot stood, his hands steady on the wooden surface despite the chaos in his mind. Rebecca Lyons sat in the front row, her pen poised over her notebook. 25 years ago," Elliot began, his voice clear and firm, "Harrington Enterprises systematically destroyed Mildred Carter's clothing company, along with dozens of other small businesses. My father, Richard Harrington, orchestrated these actions deliberately, and with full knowledge of their devastating impact on people's lives." Gasps rippled through the room. In the corner, Lauren Adams watched several board members turn red with anger. Mr. Peterson, the head of the board, was already typing furiously on his phone. "This wasn't just business strategy," Elliot continued. "It was a calculated attack on hard-working entrepreneurs, many of them minorities who pose no real threat to our corporation. We didn't just compete, we destroyed dreams, families, and legacies." Rebecca Lyons leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest as Elliot outlined his plan for reparations. "Effective immediately, Harrington Enterprises will establish a $50 million fund to compensate the families affected by our past actions. We will create an independent committee to identify victims and ensure fair distribution. Additionally, we're launching an initiative to support minority-owned businesses with interest-free loans and mentorship programs." The board members stormed out of the room before Elliot finished speaking. Only Lauren remained, her face showing both concern and pride. Back in his office afterward, the reality of his actions hit hard. Mr. Peterson and 3 other board members burst in, their faces contorted with rage. "Have you lost your mind?" Peterson slammed his hand on Elliot's desk. "You've just exposed us to countless lawsuits. The shareholders will crucify us." Another board member, Mrs. Chen, stepped forward. "We're calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. This reckless behavior cannot continue. You've left us no choice but to vote on your position as CEO. You're throwing away your father's legacy, Mr. Peterson spat. And for what? Some homeless woman who manipulated her way into your life? Elliot stood slowly, his voice quiet but firm. My father's legacy is exactly what I'm addressing. And Mildred Carter has more integrity in her little finger than this entire board combined. After they stormed out, Mildred appeared in the doorway. She closed the door softly behind her and sat across from Elliot. They're going to remove me as CEO, he said, loosening his tie. Mildred nodded. Probably. Are you prepared for that? I thought I was doing the right thing, but he gestured at the chaos of papers on his desk. Maybe I should have found a way to make changes more gradually. Sometimes, Mildred said, redemption requires sacrifice. The question is, what matters more to you? Your position or your conscience? Elliot looked out his window at the dispersing protesters. Some carried signs thanking him for telling the truth. I keep thinking about what you lost, what all those other business owners lost. It wasn't just money, it was their dignity, their dreams. And now? Now I understand that keeping my position as CEO isn't worth betraying what I've learned. He turned back to her. I won't fight the board's decision, but I'll make sure the reparation fund is legally binding before they can stop it. Mildred smiled, a mixture of pride and sadness in her eyes. You're not just losing a title, Elliot. This company has been your whole identity. Maybe it's time for a new identity, he replied, straightening the papers on his desk. One I can actually be proud of. Late that evening, Elliot sat in his home office staring at a series of emails Lauren had forwarded to him. His hands trembled as he read through the correspondence between Samuel Gray and several board members, dating back months before the press conference. I can't believe it, he muttered, scrolling through message after message. Samuel, his closest friend on the board, had been orchestrating his removal since before the whole situation with Mildred began. The emails revealed a carefully planned coup, with Samuel positioning himself as the natural successor. Lauren had discovered the emails while preparing documents for the upcoming board meeting. I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrington, she had said, her voice thick with emotion. I thought you should know before tomorrow. Now, sitting in the dimly lit office, Elliot felt the weight of isolation crushing him. He'd lost everything, his father's respect, his position, and now even his closest ally had betrayed him. The familiar urge to retreat into his old ways surfaced. Maybe if he apologized, walked back his statements about the reparation fund. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mildred stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. Lauren called me, she said simply, setting 1 cup on his desk. She told me about Samuel. Elliot laughed bitterly. Turns out I'm even worse at judging character than I thought. All these years I trusted him. He pushed away from his desk. What's the point of trying to change things if everyone's just waiting to stab you in the back? Mildred took a seat across from him, her eyes reflecting the warm lamplight. Would you like to know how I lost my business? Elliot looked up, surprised by the sudden offer. He'd been curious but had never dared to ask directly. My vice president was my best friend, Mildred began, her voice steady but tinged with old pain. Sandra Mitchell. We started the company together right out of college, built it from nothing into something beautiful. She paused, sipping her tea. When your father's company started pressuring us, Sandra met with them secretly. They offered her a position and a significant payout if she helped dismantle our company from the inside. She took it? Elliot asked, though he already knew the answer. Mildred nodded. She manipulated our books, drove away our best clients, and leaked our designs to competitors. By the time I discovered what was happening, it was too late. The scandal destroyed us. She set down her cup. I lost everything. My business, my reputation, my best friend. For months I wanted to give up, to become as bitter and cruel as the people who had hurt me. What stopped you? I realized that becoming like them meant they'd won completely. They hadn't just taken my business. They would have taken my soul. Mildred leaned forward. Samuel's betrayal hurts because you trusted him, but don't let his actions determine who you become. Elliot stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. I wanted to believe I could change things, make real improvements. But I'm alone now. Are you? Mildred's voice was gentle but firm. Lauren risked her job to show you those emails. The protesters outside supported your decision to tell the truth. And I'm still here. Elliot turned back to face her, seeing the quiet strength in her eyes that had first unsettled him months ago. You're right, he said finally. Samuel's betrayal doesn't change what's right. If anything, it proves how necessary these changes are. He returned to his desk and began gathering papers. I need to prepare for tomorrow's board meeting. They might remove me as CEO, but I'm going to make sure they hear the truth first. Mildred smiled, pride evident in her expression. Would you like some help preparing your statement? The next morning, Elliot found Mildred in the garden, tending to the roses she had planted shortly after moving in. The early summer sun cast a gentle warmth over the carefully maintained flower beds. He watched as she worked, her movements deliberate and peaceful. Would you like some company? He asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee, prepared exactly how she liked it, with just a splash of cream. Mildred looked up and smiled, accepting the cup. Thank you, Elliot. These old knees could use a break anyway. She settled onto a nearby bench, patting the space beside her. As they sat together, Elliot noticed how the morning light caught the silver in her hair. There was something regal about her presence that he'd been too blind to see when they first met. These roses remind me of George, Mildred said softly, looking at the blooming flowers. My husband always said a garden needs patience and love, just like a marriage. Elliot turned to her, curious. You've never really talked about him before. Nah. George was a quiet man with the biggest heart I've ever known, Mildred began, her eyes distant with memory. When my business fell apart, he never once complained about losing our savings. Instead, he picked up extra shifts at the factory, brought me tea every morning, and reminded me that we still had each other. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. Even when he got sick, he worried more about me than himself. The medical bills were overwhelming, but he'd still save up quarters to buy me little treats, a candy bar, a magazine, anything to make me smile. Elliot felt a tightness in his chest. How did you manage after everything you'd been through? Love, Mildred said simply. Not just romantic love, but the kind that makes you want to be better, to help others, to find beauty even in dark times. She touched a rose petal gently. George taught me that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise again. Looking at her now, Elliot saw beyond the woman he'd once dismissed as a beggar. He saw someone who had faced loss after loss but chose grace over bitterness, wisdom over revenge. The realization of how much she had taught him these past months hit him with sudden clarity. I've been thinking about my father lately, Elliot admitted, about how he raised me to believe that success meant having power over others. But watching you, he paused, struggling to find the right words. You have more dignity and strength than anyone I've ever known. You've shown me what real success looks like. Mildred reached over and patted his hand. You always had it in you, Elliot. You just needed someone to remind you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching butterflies dance among the roses. Elliot thought about how different he felt from the man who had made that cruel bet months ago. His admiration for Mildred had grown into something profound, a deep respect and affection that made him want to be worthy of her friendship. Tell me more about George, he said finally. I'd like to know about the man who helped shape such an extraordinary woman. Mildred's face lit up with a warm smile. Well, our first date was quite something. He took me to a fancy restaurant, but forgot his wallet. As she shared her stories, Elliot listened intently, treasuring each detail. The morning passed peacefully in the garden, filled with laughter and tears, as two people who had started as strangers continued to grow closer through the simple act of sharing their hearts. A week before their 3-month marriage was set to end, Elliot stood nervously in front of a restored brick building in downtown Memphis. The freshly painted sign read, Carter's Community Business Center, gleaming in the afternoon sun. He'd spent weeks secretly working with contractors to bring Mildred's old storefront back to life, transforming it into a space where small business owners could get support, training, and resources. "Can I take the blindfold off now?" Mildred asked, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "Just a few more steps." Elliot guided her carefully forward. His heart pounded as he positioned her in front of the building. "Okay, ready?" As he removed the blindfold, Mildred's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she took in the familiar storefront, now restored to its former glory. The windows sparkled, and inside, modern computers and meeting spaces waited for aspiring entrepreneurs. "Oh, Elliot," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This was my dream. All those years ago." James Turner stepped forward from the small crowd that had gathered. "Mrs. Carter, thanks to Mr. Harrington, folks like me will have a chance to learn from mentors and get the support we need to succeed." Mildred walked slowly toward the building, her hand trailing along the brick wall. "I remember the day I first opened this shop," she said softly. "I thought I was just starting a business, but it became so much more. It was a place where people could believe in themselves." Elliot watched her, his chest tight with emotion. "I wanted to give that back to you and to the community, to make things right." Mildred turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is beautiful, Elliot, but you know this isn't about making grand gestures or erasing the past." "I know," he said quietly. "It's about doing the work, day after day, to create real change." She reached up and touched his cheek gently. "You're learning. The question is, what will you do tomorrow, and the day after that, when there are no cameras or applause?" Elliot felt the weight of her words. In less than a week, their arranged marriage would end. The thought made his stomach twist with an unexpected ache. These past months with Mildred had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I want to keep learning," he admitted. "I want to do more than just open this center. I want to be here, working alongside everyone, understanding their challenges, finding ways to help." James approached them, holding a set of keys. "We've already got 20 local business owners signed up for mentoring programs," he said proudly. "People are excited about having a place where they can grow their dreams." Mildred accepted the keys, but her eyes stayed on Elliot. "Real change takes time," she said softly. "It's not about one moment or one building. It's about showing up every day, listening to people's stories, and doing the hard work of making things better." Elliot nodded, fighting the lump in his throat. With their marriage ending soon, he worried there wouldn't be enough time to prove to Mildred, and to himself, that his transformation was genuine. That the man who had made that cruel bet months ago was gone, replaced by someone who truly wanted to make a difference. As they walked through the center together, greeting community members and sharing stories, Elliot felt both pride and uncertainty. Pride in what he'd accomplished, but uncertainty about the future. He watched Mildred chat with a young entrepreneur, her face animated as she offered advice and encouragement. The thought of not seeing her every day made his heart ache in a way he hadn't expected. That evening, Elliot arranged for a private dinner at home. The dining room glowed with soft candlelight, and the chef had prepared Mildred's favorite meal, simple Southern comfort food that reminded her of home. As they sat across from each other at the large mahogany table, Elliot found himself studying her face, noting how the gentle light softened her features and highlighted the quiet dignity in her eyes. "This is lovely, Elliot," Mildred said, placing her napkin in her lap. "But I can tell something's on your mind." Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice unusually soft. "About these past months, about everything that's changed." Mildred watched him carefully, her expression gentle but guarded. "You have changed quite a bit," she acknowledged. "Because of you," Elliot said, meeting her gaze. "When I made that bet—" He paused, shame coloring his face. "I was so arrogant, so blind. I thought I knew everything about success, about life, but I didn't know anything that really mattered." Mildred set down her fork, giving him her full attention. The candlelight flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "You showed me what real strength looks like," Elliot continued, his voice growing stronger. Not the kind that comes from money or power, but from dignity, from standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything. He leaned forward, his heart pounding. Mildred, I need to tell you something. These feelings I have, they're not just gratitude or admiration. I've fallen in love with you. The words hung in the air between them. Mildred's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Elliot's heart clench. Oh, Elliot, she said quietly. Love is a complicated thing, especially when it grows in soil that was first tilled with cruelty. I know our beginning was wrong, Elliot admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But what I feel now is real. You've become the most important person in my life. Mildred reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm, comforting, but also hesitant. I see the man you're becoming, Elliot, and I'm proud of your growth. But love needs to be built on equal ground. Our story began with you holding all the power, making a bet about my dignity. Even though you've changed, that imbalance can't be ignored. Elliot felt tears stinging his eyes. I would spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that beginning, he whispered. That's exactly what concerns me, Mildred replied gently. Love shouldn't be about redemption or making amends. It should be about two people who see each other as equals, who choose each other freely, without the weight of past wrongs between them. The truth of her words hit Elliot hard. His love for her was real, but it had grown in the shadow of his guilt, his need for redemption. He understood now that loving someone meant wanting what was best for them, even if it hurt. I understand, he said softly, though his heart ached. You deserve so much more than a love built on apologies. Mildred squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Your heart has grown so much, Elliot. Don't diminish that growth by trying to turn it into something else. They sat there in the candlelight, hands clasped across the table, both feeling the weight of words spoken and truths acknowledged. The dinner grew cold before them, but neither seemed to notice, caught in this moment of tender honesty and bittersweet understanding. The boardroom crackled with tension as Elliot faced the stern faces of his board members. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun cast long shadows across the polished mahogany table. Samuel Gray sat at the far end, a smug smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Mr. Harrington, Samuel began, shuffling some papers in front of him. Your recent actions have caused significant concern among our shareholders. The board has reached a decision. He paused for effect. Either you step down voluntarily as CEO, or we'll be forced to remove you through a vote of no confidence. Elliot's hands gripped the arms of his chair, but his voice remained steady. Before you make that decision final, I'd like to say something. He stood up, looking each board member in the eye. For years, this company has operated under the belief that profit justifies everything. I was part of that problem. I inherited not just my father's wealth, but his ruthless approach to business. Lauren Adams, his assistant, quietly slipped into the room and took her place near the door, notebook in hand. Her presence gave Elliot strength. She'd witnessed his transformation firsthand. But I've learned something valuable these past months, Elliot continued. True success isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the lives we impact, the communities we serve. Samuel's smile turned to a sneer. Pretty words, Elliot, but this is business, not a charity. No, it's about responsibility, Elliot shot back. Every decision we make affects real people. I've seen it firsthand. We have the power to lift people up or crush their dreams. I choose the former. The boardroom door opened again and Mildred Carter walked in, her presence commanding immediate attention. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing her from the news coverage. Mrs. Carter, Samuel said, his voice dripping with false politeness. This is a private board meeting. As Elliot's wife, I believe I have some stake in these proceedings, Mildred replied calmly, taking a seat next to Elliot. And I have something to say to this board. She stood, her dignity filling the room. I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of ruthless business practices. This company, under Richard Harrington's leadership, destroyed my life's work without a second thought. The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Samuel tried to interrupt, but Mildred held up her hand. But I'm not here to talk about the past, I'm here to talk about change. Real, meaningful change. I've watched Elliot transform from someone who saw people as pawns to a leader who understands the weight of his responsibilities. She turned to face the board directly. You have a choice today. You can choose to remain part of the problem, focused solely on profit at any cost. Or you can be part of the solution, supporting a leader who's learned that business can be both profitable and ethical. Several board members nodded slowly, moved by her words. Even a few who had seemed firmly in Samuel's camp appeared to be reconsidering. This is absurd, Samuel sputtered. We can't base business decisions on emotional appeals. No, said Janet Chen, one of the senior board members who had been quiet until now. But we can base them on sound judgment and ethical leadership. I've been watching Elliot's recent decisions carefully. Yes, some were controversial, but they've actually strengthened our relationships with smaller businesses and improved our community standing. Our stock has taken hits, Samuel protested. Short-term fluctuations, Janet replied, but our brand reputation is improving and that's invaluable in today's market. Elliot stood tall, bolstered by the support. I'm not asking for blind faith. I'm asking for a chance to prove that doing the right thing and being successful aren't mutually exclusive. If you want me out because I refuse to crush people for profit, then vote me out. But I won't step down voluntarily. The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Mildred reached over and squeezed his hand, pride evident in her eyes. After the board meeting, Elliot and Mildred walked through the quiet garden behind his mansion. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carefully tended flowers. Mildred's steps were slower than usual, and she guided them toward a white wooden bench nestled between two flowering cherry trees. We need to talk, Elliot, she said softly, lowering herself onto the bench. Something in her voice made his heart skip a beat. He sat beside her, noticing how the sunlight caught the silver in her hair, how her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. What is it? He asked, his throat suddenly dry. Mildred took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on a distant point. I haven't been entirely honest with you. There's something I've been keeping to myself. She turned to face him, her eyes filled with a gentle sadness. I have terminal cancer, Elliot. The doctors gave me 6 months at most. That was 4 months ago. The words hit him like a physical blow. Elliot felt the world tilt beneath him, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench until his knuckles turned white. No, he whispered. There must be something we can do. I have connections, the best doctors, experimental treatments. I'll spare no expense. Elliot, Mildred interrupted gently, placing her hand over his. I've made my peace with this. I've seen all the specialists, tried all the treatments. Sometimes accepting what we can't change is the bravest thing we can do. Tears burned in his eyes. But it's not fair, he said, his voice cracking. I'm only beginning to understand. You can't leave now. Mildred's smile was tender. Life rarely follows our preferred timeline, dear. But think about what we've accomplished in these few months. Look how far you've come. Because of you, Elliot choked out. Everything good I've done has been because of you. No, Mildred said firmly. I merely showed you what was already in your heart. The choices were yours. The changes were yours. She squeezed his hand. And they need to continue being yours after I'm gone. Elliot stood up abruptly, pacing in front of the bench. Please, he begged, let me help somehow. There must be something I can do. There is, Mildred said, her voice growing stronger. Continue the work we started. Keep fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. She patted the space beside her, and he sat back down, his shoulders slumped. The community center we're building, make sure it helps people find their footing. The ethical business practices you're implementing, stand firm on those. The changes you're making in how you treat others, let those become permanent. Tears rolled down Elliot's cheeks freely now. How can I do any of this without you? Mildred reached up and wiped a tear from his face, her touch gentle. the same way I did after I lost everything. One day at a time, with grace and purpose. You're stronger than you know, Elliot. And you're not the same man who made that foolish bet 3 months ago. I love you, he whispered, the words surprising them both with their raw honesty. I don't know when it happened, but I do. I love you, Mildred. She smiled, her own eyes glistening. I know, dear. And that's exactly why I know you'll be all right. Love changes us in ways we never expect. It makes us better, stronger, more compassionate. She took his hand again, holding it firmly. Promise me you won't let this break you. Promise me you'll use it to fuel your commitment to doing good. Elliot nodded, unable to speak through his tears. They sat together in the garden as the sun continued its slow descent, their hands clasped tightly, each lost in thoughts of the precious time they had left. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filled every available seat. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the newly renovated space that had once been Mildred's clothing store. Elliot stood at the podium, his hands steady but his heart racing as he looked out at the crowd. In the front row, Mildred sat with perfect posture, her elegant gray suit matching the dignity she carried. Though thinner now, her presence commanded attention. Next to her, James Turner and his family beamed with pride, representing the first success story of what would become the Mildred Carter Foundation. 20 years ago, Elliot began, his voice clear and strong. This building housed a thriving business owned by an extraordinary woman. Through unethical practices that I'm not proud to say my family was responsible for, that business was destroyed. He paused, meeting Mildred's eyes. Today, we're not just opening a community center. We're launching the Mildred Carter Foundation, with an initial endowment of $50 million. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment. Elliot continued, This foundation will provide grants, mentorship, and resources to small business owners who face systemic barriers to success. We've already helped our first recipient, James Turner, expand his auto repair shop and hire 5 new employees from the local community. James stood up, receiving warm applause. His wife wiped tears from her eyes as their teenage daughters clapped enthusiastically. But this isn't about numbers or publicity, Elliot said, his voice softening. This is about transformation, about recognizing that success shouldn't come at the cost of others' dignity, about understanding that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the lives we touch. The crowd listened intently as Elliot detailed the foundation's plans. He announced partnerships with local banks to provide fair loans, mentorship programs pairing experienced business owners with newcomers, and educational resources for financial literacy. After the presentation, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Mildred drew Elliot aside to a quiet corner. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched his arm, but her eyes were bright and clear. You've done well, Elliot, she said softly. The foundation is a wonderful start. Start? Elliot asked, raising an eyebrow. Mildred smiled knowingly. Yes, start. The real work begins after the cameras leave and the excitement fades. It's in the daily decisions you'll make, the people you'll help when no one's watching, the principles you'll uphold when it's difficult. Elliot nodded, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. I understand. And I promise you, Mildred, I won't let you down. I know you won't, she replied, patting his hand. But remember, this isn't about me. It's about the James Turners of the world who need someone to believe in them. It's about changing a system that too often values profit over people. They watched as James showed a group of young entrepreneurs around the center, explaining how the foundation had helped him. His enthusiasm was contagious, and his audience hung on every word. Look at them, Mildred said. That's your real legacy, Elliot. Not the money you've pledged or the buildings you've renovated, but the hope you're giving people, the chances you're creating for them to build better lives. Elliot felt the weight of her words, understanding that this moment wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The foundation would require constant attention, dedication, and hard work long after the day's celebrations ended. As he looked at Mildred's proud but tired face, he silently renewed his commitment to ensuring her vision would continue to change lives for generations to come. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the bedroom windows as Mildred rested in her bed, propped up by soft pillows. Her once steady hands now lay delicate against the cream-colored sheets. Elliot sat beside her, watching as she gazed out at the garden where leaves danced in the gentle breeze. "You know," Mildred said softly, her voice weaker but still carrying that familiar warmth, "when you first proposed this arrangement, I never imagined we'd end up here." Elliot's eyes filled with tears. "I was such a fool, Mildred, the things I did, the way I thought—" "Hush now," she interrupted, reaching for his hand. "Regret is a heavy burden to carry forward. What matters is who you've become." Maria Sanchez, the housekeeper, entered quietly with a tray of tea. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she managed a warm smile as she set it down. "Just how you like it, Mrs. Carter. With honey and lemon." "Thank you, Maria," Mildred said. "You've been such a blessing." She patted the bed, inviting Maria to sit for a moment. "Both of you have become family to me." The three sat in comfortable silence as the late afternoon light painted the room in shades of gold. Other staff members moved quietly in and out, each taking moments to share gentle words or simply be present. "Elliot," Mildred said after a while, her voice growing tired but urgent, "promise me something." He leaned closer, holding her hand tighter. "Anything. Don't let this journey end with me. The foundation, the changes you've made in your company, the way you've opened your heart, these aren't just about making amends. They're about who you truly are." Tears rolled down Elliot's cheeks as he nodded. "I understand." "And forgive yourself," she continued, her breath becoming more labored. "Forgive your father too. Holding on to anger and guilt only prevents us from moving forward." Maria quietly called the other staff members into the room. They gathered around the bed, each face showing the love and respect Mildred had earned over these precious months. "You've all taught me so much," Mildred whispered, looking at each person in turn. "About family, about dignity, about the power of second chances." Her breathing grew more shallow, but her eyes remained bright and alert. "Elliot, remember what I told you about my Harold? How love isn't about grand gestures, but about the small moments of kindness we choose every day?" Elliot nodded, unable to speak through his tears. "You've learned that lesson well," she said, squeezing his hand with the last of her strength. "I'm so proud of the man you've become." The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of leaves outside. Mildred's breathing slowed, and a peaceful smile graced her lips as she looked at the family she had created in these final months. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for letting me be part of your journey." With those words, Mildred Carter closed her eyes for the last time, her hand still warm in Elliot's grip. Maria began to sob quietly, and the other staff members bowed their heads in grief and respect. Elliot sat motionless, tears streaming down his face as he held onto Mildred's hand, remembering every lesson, every smile, every moment of wisdom she had shared. The room filled with a profound sense of loss, but also of gratitude for the remarkable woman who had changed all their lives forever. In the weeks following Mildred's passing, Elliot threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. The emptiness of his house reminded him too much of her absence, so he spent his days in the community, working alongside the people she had taught him to see and value. One crisp morning, he sat across from James Turner in the small cafe attached to James's newly expanded business. Steam rose from their coffee cups as they reviewed the shop's financial statements together. "See here," Elliot pointed, his finger tracing along a column of numbers. "If we adjust your inventory ordering schedule, you could improve your cash flow significantly." James nodded, his face showing the same determination Elliot had first noticed months ago. "Mildred always said you had a good head for business. She told me you just needed to find your heart first." Elliot's throat tightened at the mention of her name. "She was right about so many things," he managed, taking a sip of coffee to hide his emotion. The door chimed as customers entered the cafe. Several greeted Elliot by name, their smiles genuine and warm. It was a far cry from the hostile stares he'd received just months earlier. Later that afternoon, Elliot attended a community meeting at the entrepreneurship center he'd established in Mildred's old storefront. The room buzzed with energy as local business owners shared ideas and supported one another. He sat quietly in the back, taking notes and listening intently, a habit Mildred had taught him. A young woman stood up to share her struggle with starting a catering business. Before Elliot could offer advice, other community members jumped in with suggestions and offers of help. He smiled, remembering Mildred's words about how true community lifted everyone up together. Back at his office, Lauren Adams brought him the latest board meeting agenda. "Mr. Gray is requesting to speak first," she said, watching Elliot's reaction carefully. Samuel Gray had been unusually quiet since the failed attempt to oust Elliot. The board had ultimately sided with Elliot's vision for the company, impressed by the positive press and community goodwill his changes had generated. When the board meeting began, Samuel stood with an air of defeated pride. "I've come to announce my resignation," he stated flatly. "It's clear that the company is moving in a different direction than I anticipated." Elliot watched his former friend, feeling not triumph but a kind of sadness Mildred would have understood. "The door will always be open for you to return," he said quietly, "if you ever decide to see things differently." Samuel's expression flickered with surprise before he gathered his papers and left the room. The remaining board members exchanged glances, then turned to Elliot with newfound respect. That evening, Elliot walked through the community garden that had been planted behind Mildred's entrepreneurship center. Local families tended to their plots. Children ran playing between the rows, and elderly residents sat on benches sharing stories. One old woman waved him over. "You're Mildred's boy," she said with a knowing smile. "She told me you'd be the one to keep this place growing." Elliot felt tears prick at his eyes, but they were different now. Not the sharp pain of loss, but the gentle ache of gratitude. He sat down beside her and listened to her stories about the neighborhood, about her grandchildren's dreams of opening their own businesses, about hope taking root like the vegetables in their garden. In these quiet moments, Elliot felt Mildred's presence most strongly. Not in grand gestures or big announcements, but in the small, daily choices to listen, to help, to care. Her vision lived on in every person he mentored, every business he helped save, every life he touched with the same grace she had shown him. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees outside the foundation's headquarters, where Elliot sat reviewing grant applications. 6 months had passed since Mildred's death, but her influence touched every decision he made. The small office, decorated with photos of successful foundation recipients, felt more like home now than his massive estate ever had. A knock on his door revealed James Turner carrying a thick folder of business plans. "Got a minute?" James asked, his confident smile a testament to how far he'd come from their first meeting. "For you? Always." Elliot gestured to the chair across from his desk. The leather squeaked as James settled in. "Remember when you first started helping with my business?" James spread the papers between them. "I was barely keeping the lights on. Now look at these expansion projections." Elliot leaned forward, studying the carefully prepared charts. "Mildred would be proud of what you've accomplished," he said softly. "She'd be proud of you too, you know." James's words caught Elliot off guard. "The way you've stuck with it, even after—" He trailed off, both men understanding the weight of the unspoken words. Through the window, Elliot could see people gathering for the Foundation's weekly small business workshop. The sight warmed his heart. Entrepreneurs from all walks of life, sharing knowledge and supporting each other's dreams. "Sometimes I catch myself wanting to ask her advice," Elliot admitted, straightening a paperclip on his desk. "Like yesterday, when we were reviewing that application from the single mother wanting to start a bakery. I kept thinking, what would Mildred say about this?" James nodded knowingly. "And what did you hear her saying?" "That numbers on paper only tell half the story. That sometimes the greatest potential lies in giving someone their first chance at dignity." Elliot smiled, remembering how Mildred had taught him to look beyond balance sheets and profit margins. The Foundation's conference room down the hall filled with voices as the workshop began. Maria Sanchez, his former housekeeper who now ran the Foundation's mentorship program, was leading today's session on financial planning. "Did you see the latest impact report?" James pulled out another document. Over 50 businesses supported in the last 6 months, 200 jobs created, but the numbers don't capture the real change. Elliot knew exactly what he meant. The real change was in the faces he saw every day. People walking taller, speaking with confidence, daring to dream bigger. It was in the way communities were coming together, supporting local businesses, creating networks of mutual support. Yesterday, Elliot shared, I visited that corner store we helped renovate last month. The owner's daughter was doing her homework behind the counter. She told me she wants to be a business consultant when she grows up, to help other small businesses like we helped her family. James grinned. That's pure Mildred right there. She always said true success creates ripples that touch generations. Standing up, Elliot walked to the window. Below, more workshop participants arrived, greeting each other with hugs and warm handshakes. He recognized faces that had once looked at him with suspicion, now offering friendly waves when they spotted him watching. You know what amazes me most? Elliot turned back to James. How she knew exactly what I needed to learn even before I did. She saw past all my everything, saw what I could become. That was her gift, James agreed. Seeing the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. The Foundation's work had become more than just redemption for Elliot. It was his calling. Each day brought new opportunities to apply Mildred's wisdom, to help others the way she had helped him. The lessons she'd taught him about dignity, perseverance, and genuine connection had transformed not just his approach to business, but his entire worldview. The cemetery was quiet except for the crunch of leaves under Elliot's feet as he approached his father's grave. The polished granite headstone bore Richard Harrington's name in bold letters, along with the dates that marked his life. Elliot hadn't visited since the funeral 3 years ago. He placed a single white rose at the base of the stone, his hand trembling slightly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds, and a cool breeze stirred the trees overhead. I've learned some hard truths, Dad. Elliot spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper. About you, about our family's legacy, about the kind of man I almost became. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Mildred showed me there's a better way to live, to do business. I know you wouldn't approve, but I'm not asking for your approval anymore. Memories of board meetings where his father had proudly crushed smaller competitors flooded back. The way Richard had taught him that power was everything, that compassion was weakness. Elliot's throat tightened. I'm going to make it right, he continued, stronger now. Every life you damaged, every dream you shattered, I'm going to find a way to balance those scales. Not because I hate you, but because it's the right thing to do. As he stood there, his phone buzzed. A message from his cousin Rachel, whom he hadn't spoken to in years after a bitter family dispute over his father's business tactics. She was responding to the email he'd sent last week, agreeing to meet for coffee. Later that afternoon, Elliot sat in a small cafe watching Rachel approach through the window. She looked older than he remembered, but her eyes still held that same determined spark. She hesitated at the door before entering. Rachel. Elliot stood, uncertain whether to offer a handshake or a hug. She solved the dilemma by sitting down directly. I almost didn't come, she admitted, ordering coffee when the waitress appeared. After everything that happened with Uncle Richard, with the way you defended him. I was wrong, Elliot said simply. About so many things. I've learned that recently, thanks to someone very special. Rachel studied him carefully, noting the changes in his demeanor. I heard about your marriage, and about your wife's passing. I'm sorry, Elliot. They talked for over an hour, slowly rebuilding bridges that had seemed permanently burned. Rachel shared stories about her children, and Elliot told her about the Foundation's work. When they finally parted, they had plans to meet again next week. That evening, Elliot made one more difficult call. Samuel Gray answered on the fourth ring, his voice guarded. Samuel, Elliot began, I think it's time we talked. They met at their old favorite bar, though neither ordered anything stronger than club soda. Samuel looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence notably absent. I understand why you did it, Elliot said after an awkward silence. The company was everything to you, and I was running it into the ground. At least that's how it must have seemed. Samuel shifted in his seat. I was wrong about that. What you're doing now, it's remarkable. The foundation, the community work. I've been following the news. I learned from the best, Elliot replied, thinking of Mildred. And I've learned that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. So, I forgive you, Samuel, and I'd like us to try being friends again. Samuel's eyes widened in surprise. Just like that? No, not just like that. It'll take time to rebuild trust, but I'm willing to try if you are. They talked late into the evening, not as former rivals, but as two men trying to find their way back to friendship. When they finally parted, something had shifted between them. Not quite healing, but the beginning of it. The community center bustled with activity as Elliot walked through its newly renovated halls. Photographs of successful entrepreneurs lined the walls, each face telling a story of dreams realized through the Mildred Carter Foundation. He paused at each one, remembering the journey that had brought them here. James Turner's auto repair shop had grown into a thriving business, now employing 15 local workers. Maria Rodriguez had opened her second bakery location, her traditional recipes drawing customers from across the city. And there was Marcus Chen, whose tech startup was revolutionizing elderly care services. Mr. Harrington? A young woman approached him, her eyes bright with determination. I'm Naomi Bennett. Thank you for meeting with me. They sat in what had once been Mildred's original storefront, now transformed into a modern meeting space that still retained touches of its historic charm. Naomi spread her business plan across the table, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. I read about Mrs. Carter in the paper, Naomi said, smoothing her skirt. About how she built her first business from nothing, lost everything, but never lost her dignity. How she changed your life. She paused, gathering courage. It changed mine too. Elliot leaned forward, interested. Tell me more. I was ready to give up on my dream of starting a sustainable fashion line. The banks wouldn't look at me, and my family thought I was crazy. Naomi's voice grew stronger. But then I read about Mrs. Carter's story, how she faced discrimination, betrayal, lost everything, but still maintained her grace and wisdom. How she turned her pain into purpose. Through the window, Elliot could see people gathering for the afternoon entrepreneurship workshop. Some were taking notes, others engaged in animated discussions. All of them were there because of Mildred's vision. Mrs. Carter taught me that success isn't just about profit, Naomi continued, her eyes shining. It's about creating something meaningful, something that lifts others up along with you. Elliot felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he witnessed Mildred's influence rippling outward. He saw it in the way the foundation's beneficiaries supported each other, sharing resources and knowledge. He saw it in the mentorship programs where successful graduates returned to guide newcomers. Your plan is solid, he said, reviewing Naomi's documents. But more importantly, I see the same spirit that Mildred would have appreciated, innovation with purpose. As they discussed the details of her proposal, more people filtered into the building. A former foundation recipient was leading a workshop on ethical business practices. Another was sharing her experience of building a cooperative childcare center. Each success story carried echoes of Mildred's wisdom, her belief in dignity, and second chances. You know, Elliot said, watching the growing crowd. Mildred once told me that true legacy isn't about buildings or money. It's about the lives we touch and the changes we inspire in others. Naomi nodded, understanding lighting her face. That's exactly why I'm here, Mr. Harrington. Not just for the funding, but to be part of something bigger, something that matters. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Elliot approached the bench where his life had changed forever. He often walked this way after community center meetings, drawn to the spot where he'd first met Mildred. The concrete was still cracked in the same places, the nearby trees just as full, but everything else felt different. A young woman sat there now holding a crying child close to her chest. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and her worn clothes told a story of hard times. The little boy, no more than 5, clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit. "It's okay, Liam," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. "We'll figure something out." Elliot slowed his pace, memories of Mildred's calm dignity washing over him. He remembered how he'd once walked past people in need without a second glance. "Excuse me," he said gently, maintaining a respectful distance. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed troubled. I'm Elliot Harrington." The woman tensed slightly, pulling her son closer. "Danielle Monroe," she replied cautiously. "And this is Liam." Liam peeked up at Elliot, tears still wet on his cheeks. "This bench," Elliot said, gesturing to where they sat. "It's a special place. Would you mind if I told you why?" Danielle hesitated, then nodded. Elliot sat on the far end of the bench, giving them space. "A year ago, I met an extraordinary woman here. Her name was Mildred Carter." His voice softened with emotion. "I was a different person then, arrogant, blind to what really mattered. But Mildred, she saw right through me." As Elliot shared Mildred's story, Liam's crying subsided. He listened intently, especially when Elliot described how Mildred had lost everything but never lost her spirit. "She taught me that true strength isn't about what you own," Elliot continued, noticing how Danielle's shoulders had begun to relax. "It's about how you treat others and face life's challenges." "I lost my job 3 months ago," Danielle admitted quietly. "The daycare costs more than I can afford now, and without childcare, I can't work full-time." She hugged Liam closer. "Sometimes it feels impossible." "Mildred would say that impossible is just a word people use when they're afraid to try," Elliot said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "The Mildred Carter Foundation helps people who are willing to work hard but need support to get started. We have a program specifically for single parents." Danielle stared at the card, hope flickering in her eyes. "Really?" "We can help with childcare, job training, whatever you need to get back on your feet." Elliot smiled at Liam, who had stopped crying completely. Mildred believed everyone deserves a chance to build a better life. "Was she nice?" Liam asked suddenly, his small voice curious. "She was the kindest person I've ever known," Elliot replied, his heart warm with the memory. "And she would have loved meeting you both." The grand ballroom of the Mildred Carter Foundation sparkled with elegant simplicity. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the diverse crowd gathered to celebrate the foundation's first anniversary. Small business owners mingled with corporate executives, while community leaders chatted with young entrepreneurs. Elliot stood at the podium, his fingers brushing against the smooth wooden surface. The painting of Mildred that would be unveiled later stood covered nearby, though he hadn't seen it yet. His heart felt full as he gazed at the faces before him. James Turner, who now mentored other small business owners, Naomi Bennett, whose tech startup was thriving, and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Mildred's legacy. "A year ago," Elliot began, his voice soft but clear, "I was a different man. I stood in boardrooms making decisions based on profit margins, never considering the lives affected by those choices." He paused, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "Then I met Mildred Carter." The room fell silent, many eyes glistening with tears as they remembered the remarkable woman who had touched their lives. "She saw through my arrogance, my privilege, my shallow understanding of success. Where others saw a wealthy CEO, she saw a lost soul in need of guidance." Elliot's voice wavered slightly. "Mildred taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build." James Turner nodded from his seat, remembering how Mildred had introduced him to Elliot, setting both their lives on new paths. "This foundation," Elliot continued, gesturing to the room around them, "isn't just about providing financial support. It's about continuing Mildred's work of seeing the potential in others, of believing in second chances, of building bridges where others see walls." Naomi Bennett wiped away a tear, clutching the hand of her business partner. Her company had been one of the foundation's first success stories. As Elliot concluded his speech, the community leaders stepped forward. They unveiled the painting, a stunning portrait of Mildred, her eyes twinkling with that familiar wisdom, her smile both gentle and knowing. The artist had captured her essence perfectly, the quiet dignity, the innate grace, the loving spirit that had changed so many lives. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he saw it. The painting showed Mildred seated on that very bench where their story had begun, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight and proud. Behind her, the artist had painted a sunrise, symbolic of the new beginnings she had inspired. "This is our gift to you," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "and to the foundation. A reminder of the woman who taught us all to see beyond appearances, to believe in the power of transformation, and to never underestimate the impact one person can have on countless lives." The room erupted in applause as Elliot stepped forward to touch the frame, his fingers trembling slightly. In that moment, surrounded by the community Mildred had helped build, he felt her presence more strongly than ever. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the busy sidewalk as Elliot sat on the weathered wooden bench. His fingers traced the smooth grain of the wood, remembering that first day he'd approached Mildred here, full of arrogance and spite. Now the bench felt like sacred ground. A small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, plopped down beside him. The child swung his legs back and forth, too short to reach the ground. "My mom says this is a special bench," the boy said, looking up at Elliot with curious brown eyes. "I'm Caleb." Elliot smiled, noticing the boy's worn sneakers and bright, intelligent face. "It is special. Would you like to know why?" Caleb nodded eagerly, scooting closer. "Right here, on this very bench, I met someone who changed my life," Elliot began, his voice gentle. "Her name was Mildred Carter. She taught me what it means to be truly rich." "Was she rich like you?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Elliot chuckled softly. "She was rich in ways I couldn't understand back then. She had wisdom, dignity, and more love in her heart than anyone I've ever known." People rushed past them on the sidewalk, businessmen checking their phones, mothers pushing strollers, teenagers with backpacks. But on the bench, time seemed to slow down. "When I first met Mildred, I thought I knew everything," Elliot continued. "I had lots of money and a big company. But Mildred showed me that being successful isn't just about having things. It's about how you treat people and what you give back to others." Caleb listened intently, his legs now still. "What happened to her?" Elliot's eyes grew misty. "She passed away, but before she did, she taught me lessons I'll never forget. She showed me that everyone deserves a second chance, that it's never too late to change, and that true happiness comes from helping others." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them. Caleb touched the bench's armrest thoughtfully. "Is that why my mom got help from your foundation? Because of Mildred?" Elliot turned to look at the boy with surprise and recognition dawning on his face. "Is your mom Sarah Wright from the bakery program?" Caleb nodded proudly. "She's opening her shop next month. She says it's because of Mildred Carter's foundation." "That's exactly right," Elliot smiled warmly. "Your mom's bakery is exactly the kind of dream Mildred wanted to help make real. She believed that everyone deserves a fair chance to succeed." People continued to stream past them, some hurrying, others strolling, each carrying their own stories. The late afternoon light turned golden, warming the bench where so much had changed. "So this bench is magic?" Caleb asked, patting the wood with his small hand. "Not magic," Elliot replied softly. "Just a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in our lives happen in the most ordinary places. Mildred taught me that too, to pay attention to the simple things, to never judge someone by how they look, and to always lead with kindness." If you enjoyed the story of Elliot and Mildred, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.